Thank you so much for being here tonight to meet our author event featuring Tony and Matt Pavia. My name is Julia Ray Hoddenfield. I'm a reader's advisor here at Darien Library and a former student of Matt Pavia. I was the third in line. I'd like to welcome you here this evening. Programs at the library are made possible by the contributions of our annual Friends of the Library campaign. Thank you for your continued support to make our collections and programs available for the community. There are few father-son duos who have impacted Fairfield County as much as Tony and Matt Pavia have. Tony Pavia taught American history and was the principal of Stamford High School, Trinity Catholic High School, and New Canaan High School. Matt Pavia works as an English teacher and American Studies teacher at Darien High School. And from a first-hand account, I can tell you they are wonderful at their jobs. Maybe you're here. Maybe you're here as a parent and your child transformed in the classrooms of one of these men. Maybe you are a former student like me and learned iambic pentameter in their classrooms and occasionally went to their offices to cry. It was a very emotional time.
We had a lot of good cries.
Or maybe you are a veteran here, and I thank you for your service and for being here. But Tony and Matt Pavia have brought their gifts to us today. Their talents for teaching extend far out of the classroom and now are transported into a book version, which we can carry in our very hands. Tony and Matt Pavia have combined forces on American Town in the Vietnam War, Stories of Service in Stamford, Connecticut, a book that highlights, demystifies, and clarifies a particularly chaotic time in history. Please silence your cell phones, and then join me in welcoming to the library Tony and Matt Pavia.
Yeah. Thank you, Julia. That was beautiful. Julia was the third of the Hoddenfield girls that I had, and by far the absolute best. And nothing could make me prouder than to know that she is now working at a library, surrounded by books and spreading her love of reading and learning with people. So thank you, Julia Ray.
First, thank you all for coming. And in coming, you are also honoring a group of Americans who have been totally underappreciated, and we will get to that later. They have been the backbone of the last several generations in this country. I'm going to hand this first part over to Matt. He's going to talk a little bit about the process.
Well, I think the first thing we want to do, is just show you a short film that we have that I don't think needs much explanation. So here you go. In a moment, read to you a bit of the introduction. But before I do, I think I'd just like to explain how the book is arranged and broken up. There are essentially three different parts to the book. The first is oral history. There are 39 or 40 oral histories. They are the stories of surviving veterans, spouses of veterans, relatives of some of the young men who were killed, and in one case, even a Vietnamese orphan refugee who was adopted by a family in Stamford and his parents. And in that section, we just hope to let those stories speak for themselves. The second section of the book is a series of biographies, one for each of the 29 boys, really, from Stamford who were killed in the Vietnam War. And the third part is the story of Stamford itself as a city in transition, but also as a microcosm of the United States. I know many people in the room are from Stamford. Some of you are from Darien, and I think anyone who knows anything about Stamford could tell you that demographically, it does represent the United States in pretty much every socioeconomic category, the diversity of the country. And so we felt that in trying to tell the story of the experiences of people from one town, and by chronicling the changes and conflicts in one American city, we could better understand the war and also what was going on in the United States during that very chaotic time. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the interviews that we conducted with veterans and with the loved ones of the deceased. And this is just the about the interviews section from the introduction. Late in the summer of 2015, we embarked on a remarkable journey. In VFW halls and people's living rooms, over email and by phone, we interviewed Vietnam veterans, family members, and friends whose lives were touched by one of the longest, costliest, most polarizing wars in our nation's history. By the time we finished, we had spoken with more than 100 residents of the same city about their deeply personal connections to the war. It was never our intention to collect war stories, at least not in the most limited understanding of the phrase, which suggests graphic descriptions of horror and battlefield heroics. From the outset, our goal was to provide a view of the Vietnam War through several lenses, one that captured and honored the varied experiences of the population of one American town, and by extension, those of veterans nationwide. Not all of the accounts pertain to combat. While most accounts do tell the stories of those who experienced the horrors of war firsthand, we've also captured the stories of families and friends whose lives were altered permanently by the war. More often than not, these interviews unearth incredible sorrow and human tragedy. And still, for us, the experience of meeting these veterans and their families and of seeing the lives they have lived since the war has been uplifting. More than anything else, what we received was an incredible education in the human cost of war and the pain so many carry in silence. More importantly, we witnessed the virtue of human resilience. The men we met bore only a passing resemblance to the caricature of Vietnam veterans depicted in popular culture. They represent a tremendous diversity of backgrounds, military experiences, and viewpoints. Like the veterans of the Second World War, these men were called at a very young age to serve their country. And like their fathers, Vietnam veterans were asked to make tremendous sacrifices and bear witness to incomprehensible tragedy. Unlike World War II veterans, however, the burden of the Vietnam War was borne by a much smaller segment of the population. Some of the young men and women from Stamford who served did so by choice, while others were sent across the globe by the dictate of the draft board or later the lottery. While most of their friends were working or continuing their education, these young men and women found themselves thousands of miles from home in a place few had ever heard of, living in conditions that their friends and families could hardly imagine. Like earlier generations of veterans, the Vietnam veterans with whom we spoke were unfailingly modest. Although they were asked to do the impossible, to perform their duties in brutal, searing heat, monsoons, insect-infested jungles, and in terrain that was the enemy's own backyard, all while being vilified at home, each was firm in the conviction that he was lucky, that others had it worse. Nonetheless, the hurt remains. These boys returned as young men, eager for acceptance and anxious to get on with their lives. They came home to a place that treated them, at best, with ambivalence, and often with outright hostility. In our conversations with these men, roughly 50 years later, their wounds were fresh. They still feel the sting of having been looked down upon, even by older veterans, for having lost the war. None of the veterans with whom we spoke found glory in war. They held widely different opinions about every aspect of it, but they were nearly unanimous in the belief that they answered a calling and that they did the best they could to honor their obligations to their country. When asked about medals or commendations, they were far prouder of the families they built and the lives they led after the war. Our book is not a comprehensive history of the war in Vietnam. It simply represents the experiences of the citizens of one American town. In most cases, our interviews did not even scratch the surface. Whether it was due to modesty or to avoid reliving the pain of their experiences, many of the veterans left much unsaid. There was clearly ground on which they chose not to tread. What these printed accounts can never adequately express is the poignancy and eloquence of all that was left unsaid. One veteran, whom we've known well for years, wrote us after the interview to say that there was much he didn't share with us. Those memories, he wrote, were to be saved only for the men with whom he served. There are many aspects of war, we learned, that can be understood only by those who experience it. And some experiences are too painful and horrific to be shared. Thank you.
One of the major parts of our research was to study all of the young men who were killed in Vietnam. And as you saw in the film, that number's at 29. And that's a revised number that came about through a lot of our research. This was the third highest total in Connecticut, and it was behind only New Haven with 38 and Hartford with 39. And considering at that time that Stamford was probably the fifth or sixth largest city, that's a rather high number. Today it's second or third in the state. The chronology of their death follows exactly the trajectory of the war, beginning with Alvin Kowski, who was the first Stamford man to be killed in Vietnam. In 1961, his plane was shot down over Laos before the official start of the war. His name appears on the Vietnam Wall on panel 1, line 1. He is the fourth name on the Vietnam Wall. Fraser was the last young man from Stamford killed. He was killed in April of 1971. So Stamford went from 61 to 71. The first official combat death was Richard, who was killed on August 64. That same year, two other Marines were killed in Vietnam, Norman Spinard and William Mitchell. Again, they were all Marines. Richard Broadhurst was also the first Marine killed in the state of Connecticut, which means he was killed very early on in the war because the first combat troops were Marines. Richard Broadhurst, the first picture, and the second picture, were born on the exact same day, only feet apart, December 31st, 1946, in Stamford Hospital, and both were 19 years old at the time of their death. The youngest killed, William, who was 19 years and 2 months old. The oldest was Richard Rich, who was a ranking naval officer killed from Stamford. Richard Rich was married and had 4 boys. 9 of the men were married, 5 had children. Bobby Dwyer's wife gave birth to his daughter just 1 day before he died. 5 men were declared missing in action in Vietnam. Stuart Andrews, Richard Rich, and Al Bankowski were all missing in action for almost 50 years until they were identified in the 21st century. Douglas Arcano and William Nickerson found. Of the 29, they came from all different backgrounds. One was famously known for protecting the neighborhood kids from bullies and fiercely protecting the men of his platoon. That's John Michael Pellegrino. One was killed just 14 days after he arrived in Vietnam. That's Andrew Chowka. They were of all backgrounds, white, black, some of Polish, Irish, Italian descent. One had a license plate that jokingly said WASP. One was born in East Germany and fled East Germany moments before his entire family was kidnapped by the Soviets. Alfred Kaspel, who died early in the war, was a United States Marine. At least 3 never finished high school, but at Ivy League colleges. One had just won. Thomas Morris had just completed his PhD. One, a great athlete, James Wright Tech gave the Champion of the Year award for the very best athlete. Michael Vagnon, an outstanding musician who played in local bands. One inspired 3 fellow Marines to drive all the way across the country to pay their respects from the family as soon as they came home. Our research also added 4 names to the memorial wall in Stamford. The original number on that wall was 25. Our research added 4 more: Eugene Mansell, the third, Stuart Andrews, and Richard Rich, who were missing in action. So when Veterans Park was constructed, their names were not on the wall. And of course, Alfred Caspal, who was listed from Reading, Pennsylvania, even though he had left the Marines from Rippoam High School. His home is also, and it shows you the craziness of this, is also Newport Beach, right, California? Malibu, California. There's a park named after him. Working with the families, James Branson. James Branson was a wonderful young man. We reached out to his friends, and one of his friends most poignantly gave Matt and I a very gentle caution. He said, be very careful here. You're treading on hallowed ground, which we thought was an incredible statement. But he really didn't know what to expect from us. So James Branson was adored by the men who served with him. Working with the families was the most difficult part of this book. It was also the most inspiring. We met with and called across the country, as far away as Colorado and Texas. We called families who were generous with us, and they were willing to talk with us and relive probably the most difficult and trying days of their entire lives. As a good friend of Jim Branson later told us, time is no barrier to the pain and heartache that I shoulder each day. And that was really, I think, says it best for all of the 29 families.
We just have a few assorted stories from I wanted to share. Mike Harding, who's in the room today. Where were you again, Mike? There you are. Okay, you moved on me. So on the right, you'll see Mike Harding. Mike Harding joined the Navy out of school. At around the same time, his childhood best friend and next-door neighbor, Norm Spinard, joined the Marines after graduating from Stamford Catholic High School. Marines and the Navy, 2 different branches of service. They really didn't know where the other was. They just kind of vaguely knew that each was serving in some capacity. Mike was stationed on the USS Valley Forge. Did I get that right? The USS Valley Forge in 1965. And a complement of Marines arrived because at that point, early on in the war, the Marines were still operating from ships. They would live quarter on the ship, fly out, they'd be helicoptered out onto mainland Vietnam, and then return. And after Mike had been on the ship for a while, all of a sudden a complement of Marines came in, and who does he bump into on the deck of the ship but his next-door neighbor and best friend, Norm Spinard, of all the gin joints in all the world, right? And they got to spend a lot of time together. Was it about a month? About 6 months they got to spend together, each introducing each other to their friends, and just probably finding great comfort in having someone from the real world there with them. One morning, Norm's unit was getting ready to go out for an amphibious assault. He happened to catch Mike in the morning, who was on duty, and Mike said, "I'll help you pack your bags." He helped Norm pack his bags, and he said, "I'll see you later." And that was the last he ever saw or spoke to Norm Spinard, who was killed that day. I can't, it's hard to even imagine. Life magazine, in June of 1969, decided that they wanted to make a statement about the progress of the war, or the lack of progress of the war. And so they decided they would pick 1 week in the spring of 1969 and they would run a picture of every American serviceman who was killed in that one randomly chosen week. And this is the cover of that issue. It's called The Faces of the American Dead. There's an editorial that basically asks the country, or tells the country, that they have to look at these faces and they have to think about what that means in all kinds of ways. And the photos take up pages and pages. They're arranged like a high school yearbook. And right there on one of those pages is Isaac Sapp, 21. It says there he's from Williston, South Carolina. He was living in Stamford. He's on the Stamford Memorial. This was one of the mysteries that we had to figure out. We couldn't find him in any of the local high school yearbooks. We really weren't able to track down anyone who knew him. And we just kept digging, and eventually, after some online searching, I went onto the Vietnam Veterans Memorial website, and where people can post remembrances, people, family members, friends, people who served. And I noticed scrolling down that a woman in Williston, South Carolina, just left a post saying, "To Isaac, I took your sister to see you at the Wall That Heals," which is the smaller traveling Vietnam memorial. And she thankfully left her email. And I had been searching for a long time for some kind of lead, and I finally found this. And I talked with her. She put me in touch with Isaac Sapp's sister in Williston, South Carolina. And I said, well, I asked her if she would be willing to call the sister, Sarah was her name, on my behalf, because the last thing I wanted to do was just call someone out of the blue, almost 50 years after a horrible event. She doesn't know me, and say, hey, can we talk about your brother who was killed? So through this other woman, Hattie King was her name, I eventually got in touch with Isaac. And the first question I had to ask is, what's his connection to Stamford? He's on our list, but we can't find any record of him. And it turns out that the story is another one of those stories that is very local, but also very much in keeping with the larger history of the country. Like so many African Americans in the 20th century, Isaac Sapp, after going to a segregated high school in rural South Carolina, thought that he could have a better life, that he could have better career opportunities, and that he could be treated with more dignity up north. And so he and his best friend, a fellow named Grady Seabrooks, they came up north together, and they stayed with Isaac's older brother. They were living in Stamford. Isaac worked for Clairol for a couple of years. And then he joined the Marines because he thought, again, that given his circumstances in life, joining the Marines would be another opportunity for him to better his future. And if he was going to serve, he wanted to, as his sister said, he wanted to be with the best, the U.S. Marine Corps. And so he signed up, he and his buddy Grady signed up together, because there was a program at the time that was, I don't know what the official name, but colloquially it was referred to as the buddy system, or the buddy program, where if you signed up with a friend, the military would agree to keep you together. So Grady and Isaac left Stamford for Parris Island with the promise that they would be kept together. And almost instantly when they arrived at Parris Island, they were separated and sent into different units, which was not uncommon, we came to find out. And Isaac was killed. He was killed in line of duty. The circumstances are not entirely clear. There are some conflicting reports that we uncovered in declassified military after-action reports. But I ended up speaking with Grady's brother, a man named Freddie Seabrooks, also down in South Carolina. And he told me a lot of this story. And he said that his brother, Grady Seabrooks, never was the same again. He made it home safe and sound, at least physically sound. But he to some degree, he blamed himself for letting them separate him and Isaac. And he for the rest of his life, a very troubled life, for the rest of his life, he felt this absence, as if a brother, as if a soulmate had died. Still living every day with the regret that he and his buddy were separated, that they weren't kept together, that as if he could have done something for them if they were together. But I bring this story to you because I think it's just an interesting example of how a local story, or in this case, Stamford, Connecticut, it does tell the story of the larger country. This is a story of the Great Migration, as well as a story of the Vietnam War. My favorite little detail from Isaac's sister, Sarah, was that for the segregated K-12 school that he and the other African-American kids went to, Isaac drove the bus. So he'd get up in the morning, get in the bus, which they parked on their property, and pick up all of the kids who went to this school, bring them to school, bring them all home, and then come home and park the bus in the front lawn. And to me, that's, I think, the greatest illustration of the way in which uncovering these stories really helped me see the 58,000 plus names on the wall as humans, as people with lives and quirks. Norm Spinard used to have pet squirrels, and he walked them on a leash. All kinds of fascinating little tidbits like that. And so I wanted you to know about Isaac.
I'm going to close with a very positive story, but before I do, you've been very patient. I want you all to silently promise me that you read at the end of the book, Shattering the Myth. I could stand up here all day and say those stereotypes about Vietnam veterans, don't believe them, but nothing says it better than that. It'll give you a statistical breakdown. So I'll say this, don't believe media portrayals of Vietnam veterans, but I say, promise me you'll read that section, Shattering the Myth. We will end with a positive story. In 1975, 2 years after the ceasefire, the North Vietnamese broke the ceasefire and invaded the South. And as they were invading, there was mass panic fleeing to the South. There were victims all over the place, but nowhere were there greater victims than orphans. And it was clear that orphans who were the children of Vietnamese women and American soldiers had no future in Vietnam. They had none. And so groups of Americans decided to send planes over there and try to evacuate these kids before the Vietnamese came in. So a huge jumbo jet was sent over there. They hollowed out the jumbo jet. They put seatbelts in the floor. CBS filmed the whole thing. The reporter is gleeful, saying this, amidst all of this tragedy, this is the one bright spot that these young children are going to get out of there. He signs off, plane takes off. Minutes later, that same reporter comes back on, and he said, just moments ago, this plane left. All I could say is, where will the misery end? Plane crashed. There were 300 children, about half of them lived. Enter Bob McCauley, an area man who worked with orphans, and a giant. The more you learn about it. Bob McCauley tries his credit card first. Says, I want to send the plane in there. Here's my credit card. They said, hey, what planet are you from? We're not taking your credit card. He put his house up. Bob McCauley put his house up. He financed another jet to go in and pick up these children. He then rallied all of the people in this area who worked for his agency, Friends of Children. They dealt with orphans all over the world. That plane came in. It landed in California. They had very bad conditions in California. Bob McCauley said, bring him to Fairfield County. So how did he get this jet? Hugh Hefner donated the Playboy jet. So, no lie, look it up, look at their pictures with Playboy bunnies aboard the plane. The Playboy bunny lands at JFK Airport, and within hours of the Pope landing at JFK Airport. Plane lands, Playboy bunnies come out. Daily News has pictures of Playboy bunnies. They load them on buses. Bob McCauley says, don't tell anybody where they're going. Well, where are they going? Stamford, Connecticut. So 45 children were bused to Stamford. Calls Rita. He says, clean the house out. We got 45 kids coming. He said, what am I going to do? He said, you figure it out. Click. He hangs up. Mr. Pavia, I'm going to show you something. He shows me the newspaper with his picture and his mother holding him. Maria Nakian, who became a prominent member of the Board of Representatives in Stamford. So,
okay, well, if you have any questions, we're happy to answer them. If not, we're happy not to answer them. can't tell you how many times he'd call me telling me what the people inside the computer had done to a particular file, where they had put it. But anyway, I would just say, from my perspective, it's selfishly, from a storyteller's perspective, the thing that makes the Vietnam War such a rich subject is it's just unbelievably complicated and ambiguous and ill understood. I've spent years reading everything I get my hands on about it and talking to people, and I still can't fully wrap my mind around it from every angle and every perspective and all the alternative scenarios and who knew what and when did they know it and should we, did we, could we, all of that stuff. But the thing that always, as a kid growing up well after the war, in the 80s and in the 90s, it was pretty clear to me that Vietnam veterans did not have the same comfort speaking about their experiences generally, and they were not given the same kind of adulation that the World War II generation had gotten. And we know historically from all of the protests around the country, different demonstrations, that the American public had a hard time separating the people who planned the war and conducted it and the kids who were asked to go and fight it. And to me that just seemed like an incredible disservice because they were teenagers. Most of them had no idea where Vietnam was. They just knew that their parents, their neighbors, their uncles were veterans. They had done their part. They'd come back. They'd lived their lives. That was just what they thought you did. It was just a way. It was an obligation that you paid back. It was part of your birthright. And so to me, it always seemed particularly tragic that good-intentioned American kids who just wanted to do what they were supposed to do were blamed for the myriad problems that came out of the war.